I can't hang out any longer, man. We need to get some shelter.
Did see a cabin when I was doing my scout earlier. It's just a little ways that way. It's creepy over there, and it's right next to the woods, but at least we have a windbreak.
Portlock wasn't just abandoned, it was expelled. A place so rich in fish, timber, and promise that people kept returning until something kept driving them out. From crushed skulls and missing hunters to trees found rammed upside down into the earth. This is the Alaskan ghost story locals still whisper about. Tonight, we go past campfire talk and into the records. Spanish sailors who fled, British charts that warned, Alutiiq elders who imposed curfews, and a final overnight exodus in 1950. Is Portlock a Bigfoot slaying ground, or the perfect storm of fear, isolation, and something we can't name? Cursed from first landing. When outsiders first touched the rocky shores of Portlock, they expected bounty, not dread. The Spanish were among the earliest to set foot here in the late 1700s, drawn by the promise of fertile land, thick forests, and endless fish. What they found instead were echoes in the night, haunting cries drifting out of the dark timber. Soon, sickness spread through their crew. Perfectly healthy men became dizzy, weak, and overwhelmed with a sense that they did not belong. Fear mounted so quickly that they abandoned the site altogether. For them, this place was cursed, though no one could say by whom or what. Just 6 years later, the British tried their luck. Captain Nathaniel Portlock, a seasoned navigator, was no man to be swayed by superstition. Yet, when he and his crew arrived in 1785, the same baffling signs awaited them. They discovered an abandoned native village, its structures weathered but not destroyed. Why had the people left so suddenly, with the land still fertile and game still plentiful? That mystery hung over the British as they set up camp. At first, everything seemed manageable, until sickness, eerily similar to what the Spanish had endured, began to spread. Men grew restless, some refused to work, and whispers of bad omens circulated. The dread became unbearable. Finally, Portlock relented to his men's pleas and sailed away. Another attempt had collapsed without explanation. From bad luck, it was now turning into a pattern. Portlock will be forever associated with this place, but not as a founder. Rather, he is a cautionary tale. Every record of early attempts speaks the same language, of optimism, of sickness, then dread, and finally, of abandonment. Timber, fish, security from the storms of open sea, these were all things that Portlock offered to settlers, but some unseen force seemed to repel the very same people. These first accounts, of almost no significance in exploration journals for later generations, became almost the crucible of the curse story. Locals highlighted the retreats of the Spanish and British as evidence that Portlock was not meant to be disturbed. Moreover, the deserted native village cast a bit of dread into the story. If the original people, who knew the land best of all, decided to evacuate, what kind of warning might that have given? To put oneself in the position of the people of those days is the best way to understand fear. Imagine having traveled thousands of miles across wild oceans and being denied final victory not by an enemy or by a storm, but by something unknown and unnamed. There were no engagements, no sudden disasters, no starvation, only whispers, sickness, and an ever-increasing weight that seemed to press down on the soul until it begged to leave. Such an innocent menace set Portlock apart from all other frontier nightmare stories. The tales of monsters are dismissed by skeptics, but they find the early stories puzzling. Why would two different crews from Europe, years apart, experience the same haunting phenomena? Could territorial forces, perhaps air toxins, strange geology, or isolation distort the perceptions of the settlers? Or was it something altogether less base? An unseen predator able to manifest its presence without ever coming into view? Whatever the cause may have been, that first landing put Portlock on the map. It was not a place to settle. It was a place people fled from. The settlers who came after would be shadowed by these earlier failures. The curse was not folklore yet. This was lived experience, written into logs and maps, whispered in taverns by men with no reason to make it up. The terror didn't always roar, it hummed, and it made even healthy men stumble. The predator you can't hear. The settlers of Portlock reported no battlefield, no wild bear charging from the woods, and no tangible enemy they could point to. What they described was stranger, an overwhelming sickness, dread that came from nowhere, and the sense that an unseen force was closing in. This brings us to one of the most chilling theories attached to the Portlock mystery: infrasound. Infrasound refers to sound waves that vibrate at frequencies too low for the human ear to detect. While we can't consciously hear them, our bodies can feel them. Exposure has been linked to headaches, nausea, disorientation, and even panic attacks. Scientists studying tigers have observed that these predators use infrasound to stun or confuse prey before striking. Similarly, elephants and whales are known to communicate using these low-frequency rumbles that travel vast distances. In nature, infrasound is both a weapon and a warning system. What if the Spanish sailors and Portlock's British crew weren't simply struck by disease or bad food, but by something in their environment radiating this invisible pressure? Men who were otherwise strong suddenly staggered with dizziness. Others grew paranoid, unable to shake the sensation of being watched. And always, there were the haunting cries from the forest, sounds that might have been distorted or amplified by low frequencies. Imagine being isolated in an unfamiliar land and feeling waves of dread wash over you without explanation. For a superstitious 18th century sailor, it was enough to invoke demons or curses. For modern researchers, it sounds suspiciously like the side effects of infrasound exposure. This theory is further supported by geography. Portlock, on the other hand, really perched at the edge of a wild and rugged Alaska coastline and surrounded by thick forests, steep cliffs, and echoing valleys. Fog rolls in often, blotting out all sound and at the same time providing ideal conditions for oddballing out acoustic effects. The surf crashing into gorges, the wind whistling through ravines, or even slight seismic activity could result in low-frequency vibrations that bounce and propagate. In such an environment, it is not implausible for concentrated groups of individuals to experience the same invisible attack on their senses. The infrasound explanation likewise comes with some rather troubling implications. When infrasound was present, what was producing the sound? Many look at natural causes, geological shifts, howls of storms, or the resonances of wind through cavernous spaces. Others wonder if some apex predator, perhaps even the legend of Nantina, has the ability to harness or emit these, similar to tigers. If so, then Portlock was stalked by something whose weapon was stitched within its flesh, not just haunted by misfortune. However, the infrasound theory critics raise a valid point. It could account for the malaise, the paranoia, and the terrible dread. But it could not explain the more corporeal aftermath. Bodies crushed, sleds thrown, dogs torn apart. Nothing about infrasound will toss a man's sled dozens of feet or leave claw-like rips in human flesh. For all of that, you require raw force, the kind that comes with mass and intent. In other words, infrasound can, at best, be described as an initial strike by infringing human spirits, scattering groups, or making prey easier to pick off. It doesn't end the case, though. Its staying power is because it bridges science and superstition, for the skeptics can thus easily deny Portlock's curse, instead attributing phenomena to the more natural causes. And believers can explain the phantom as an animal that lies within the woods and has made fear itself into a weapon of attacks. At the same time, the two factions sadly agree on one haunting issue. What happened in Portlock was genuine, though they could not see it. So picture yourself in a misty little settlement standing arms of ghosts, while the trees feel thrumming with some invisible pressure. Your head aches, your stomach turns, and suddenly there's none, but every shadow feels threatening. Would you wait to see what's coming? Or would you pack up and run away, like so many have done before you? If the hum softened resolve, something with hands finished the job. Cannibal giants on the coast, When the Sugpiaq people, often called the Alutiiq, tried to settle near Portlock in the 1800s, they did so with full knowledge of its unsettling reputation. To them, the land was rich in salmon and game, a perfect foundation for survival. But prosperity came with a darker price. The stories they carried with them weren't whispers of fog or faint cries. They were warnings of the Nantina, the creature often described as half-man, half-beast. In their oral traditions, the Nantina wasn't a distant myth. It was said to roam the coasts and forests, hunting when food was scarce, and worse, preying on humans when opportunities arose. Accounts describe them as giants, towering, hairy figures with the strength to snap trees and carry people away. Some versions insist these beings were cannibals, targeting villagers when hunting yielded little. In this sense, the Nantina weren't just predators of the wilderness, they were predators of people. Alas, warnings like these became a burdensome lived experience for the Sugpiaq, who sought to thrive here. Raids were reported at night. Absolutely, hunters disappeared into the forest and never returned. Some women gathering food near riverbanks had complained about being stalked by some huge figures. The attacks, attested the elders, were calculated rather than random. They took place at times of scarcity of food, when winter most pressed, or when villagers strayed too far from the safety of their camps. For outsiders, these stories sound much like folklore meant to alienate children. But in the Sugpiaq worldview, those tales operated as survival code. Do not think about wandering alone. Make no unnecessary noise. Stay out of the woods after dark. Not bedtime warnings. Proper rules, keeping all alive in a land where the line between natural and supernatural felt dangerously thin. Horrifyingly, the name given to these creatures, sometimes translated as cannibal giants, is not at all representative of the encounters experienced with them. Unlike bears or wolves, the Nantina blurred to vague limits well understood. They were too human in form and too crafty in nature. The hunters were described by the villagers as such, those who contributed their efforts towards some intention, not from instincts like true animal behavior. Rather, this made them all the more terrifying. Imagine building a house, netting fish, and cultivating a family in a village that appeared quite good, and then feeling the tree line watching you. Imagine hearing something moving a couple of paces away from the fire's light on two legs. When game disappeared from the surroundings, the villagers knew it wasn't under just the test of nature. Something might be stalking them up next. Eventually, the Sugpiaq retreated and abandoned their attempt to settle into a permanent dwelling within Portlock. Raids indiscriminately exacerbated the fear and tension surrounding the area. They left, taking with them their personal belongings, and with them, the stories that would henceforth shape and scar the very cultural fabric of Alaska. So much so that these stories were repeated from one generation to the next as warnings. Unlike most folk tales, these included tales that were never softened over time. If anything, their sharpness, vividness, and insistence only increased as the legends of the Nantina told of something that truly walked on that coast. This chapter from the Portlock saga stands out as unnerving because it predates the industrial settlements by almost a century. Before canneries or schools got established, even before Andrew Kamuck died an unholy death, the Sugpiaq had already come, tried the land, and lost. They left behind not just an account of tragedy, but a stark warning that humankind was not the only species in this place. Then came a modern village that wrote those rules in ink and broke them. The Survival Rule Book, 1921 to 1930. By the early 20th century, a new wave of settlers believed they could succeed where everyone else had failed. The region's resources were too tempting to ignore. Salmon runs thick in the rivers, towering spruce for lumber, and fertile soil for gardens. In 1921, a determined group of mostly Alutiiq and Aleut families, joined by other workers, established a town on the site now known as Portlock. They built not just cabins, but a community with industry, a salmon cannery, a schoolhouse, even a post office. For the first time, Portlock looked like it could stand the test of time. But this settlement didn't thrive on optimism alone. From the very beginning, the villagers lived under a strict rule book of survival. They imposed curfews that kept everyone indoors by nightfall. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter of the settlement. No one, under any circumstances, was to wander into the fog-choked forest alone. Elders insisted on silence when moving near the tree line. Children were warned that laughter, shouting, or any unnecessary noise might draw attention. These weren't quaint traditions. They were measures rooted in fear. The system went on for close to a decade. Cannery jobs, whose wages fed families, fostered an appearance of stability in the settlement. Visitors from other outlying villages would always comment on the orderliness that characterized Portlock's appearance. But under this veneer was constant vigilance. With prosperity came tension. They didn't build fences just to keep animals out. They built them to remind themselves where safety stopped and danger began. In fact, every Alutiiq elder would speak of the Nantina, the sinister, cannibal giant haunting their people's narratives. To outsiders, such warnings might sound like superstitions. In the townspeople's eyes, they were utterly practical. Hunters had to go in pairs. Foggy days meant that they'd stay close to camp. The villagers acted as they knew that there was something invisible living in the woods, something that respected boundaries, until those boundaries were crossed. As time passed, however, such comforts bred complacency. The cannery thrived, and for years nothing happened, and so the rules began to fall away. Patrols let up, and some men even began to hunt farther into the forest for timber and game. The families began taking the curfew less seriously, believing the tales of Nantina to be exaggerated. Gradually, Portlock started to forget the very discipline that had kept it alive. And this is where things take a sinister turn. What happens when someone ignores that boundary of safety and danger? For many years, Portlock existed as an unlikely success story amid widespread failure. But that success was tenuous. These days, when the guard of the villagers is down, the very thing from which their ancestors had shielded themselves would find entrance. Survival wasn't so much about superstition. It was about respect. It is a recognition that the forest was not empty, that the land itself demanded caution. Anyone living there knew that whatever rules were laid down were not suggestions but a sort of defense. When that defense became weak, cracks began to form, and through those cracks, something began creeping back into Portlock. One logger crossed that line, and the forest answered violently. The slaying that broke the town. By 1931, Portlock's rulebook of silence and curfews had begun to erode. People felt safer, more confident, even a little dismissive of the warnings that had once governed their every move. But it would only take one horrific event to remind them why the rules had existed in the first place. That reminder came in the form of Andrew Kamuck's death. Andrew was a logger, strong, skilled, and experienced in the wild. One day, he ventured deeper into the forest than most dared to go. When he didn't return, fellow workers launched a search party, expecting perhaps a simple accident with equipment or a misstep on rough terrain. What they found was something that left even hardened woodsmen shaken to their core. Andrew's body was discovered in pieces. His head had been crushed with such force that some speculated it was smashed by his own heavy logging sled. But the sled itself was found flung far from where he lay, as though hurled aside with impossible strength. Nearby, his sled dogs had been slaughtered, their remains scattered across the clearing. It wasn't just violence, it was overlay. What do you expect of the fellows who discovered the scene? Were they able to articulate what they saw? The obvious answer would be that a bear did the deed, but bears do not send sleds flying dozens of feet, nor do they slay for reasons of anger against hunger. This slaughter had a very personal air to it, almost as if it was not predetermined by survival, but meant to prove dominancy. The incident that occurred to Andrew seemed to be one with a message. This land is not yours. Andrew's death rapidly spread through the town, and along with it went waves of fear that no amount of calmness would ever keep quiet. Suddenly, rules that had grown soft, no wandering into the fog, no travel alone, were reinstated with a vengeance. armed patrols, curfew, and families barricading their doors at dusk. The damage was done. The feeling of safety was gone. Another freaky event followed to confirm the dread of the community. A man by the name of Tom Olson was said to have sighted movement on the beach by a huge, hairy bulk. Armed with a rifle and with the opportunity to shoot, he froze. The creature was simply too monstrous, too alien. Olson later confessed that he could not pull the trigger, as if the whole event just overwhelmed him with uncontrollable logic. His sighting spread like wildfire through Portlock, tying Andrew's gruesome death to the monster that many now believe to be the Nantina. Apologize again for the imbalance of the paragraphs. Beginning narration of deaths and disappearances will be alike. From that point forward, disappearances mounted. Hunters never returned from the bush. Loggers sometimes disappeared from work sites. Passing prospectors left no evidence behind. When bodies were found, the mutilations were too severe and too strange to be attributed merely to bear attacks. The skeptics carried on with their argument. The townspeople had begun to see a pattern. Claw-like marks that looked make-believe. Bones fracturing in manners hinting at raw, deliberate power. An impossibly regular pattern tied to disappearances associated with the woods. In what came to be known as the turning point of Andrew Kamuck's slaying, the old-time Nantina was known as a legend, an invisible presence, a nameless power that peculiar laws and warnings kept at bay. Afterward, it became flesh and blood, capable of tearing men and animals limb from limb. The whole paradigm was torn to shreds, and the people of Portlock understood they were not preventing a monstrous force from entering. It was in their midst. And then terror didn't nibble at the edges. It swallowed the town whole. The overnight escape, 1950. For nearly 3 decades after Andrew Kamuck's death, Portlock carried on under a shadow. People still worked in the cannery, children still attended the school, and families still called the little coastal town home. But the confidence that once defined the settlement was gone. Everyone knew the stories. Everyone remembered the gruesome scenes, and everyone had heard footsteps in the night that sounded far too heavy to belong to a man. It was a community living on borrowed time. By the late 1940s, disappearances had grown too frequent to ignore. Hunters set out and didn't return. Prospectors vanished into the timber. Loggers were found in states too violent to be written off as accidents. Reports suggested that as many as 3 dozen residents over the years had either gone missing or turned up brutally mutilated. While skeptics argued these deaths could be blamed on bears, the townspeople had stopped believing that long ago. Bears didn't stalk in pairs, bears didn't fling heavy sleds, and bears didn't make guttural, human-like sounds that carried through the fog. Again and again, the tightened rules of the community curfews, armed patrols, paired walking through the woods, have proved scant comfort. The old Alutiiq name for it, Nantina, seemed to be growing bolder than ever. No longer was it just in the forest. It was now at the edges of town, creeping closer. People began to report 2-legged footsteps crunching outside their cabins at night. Others hushedly spoke of strange cries brought on by the wind, sounding through the valley like mocking the very rules meant to keep the town safe. This terrible moment came all of a sudden, straight after the perceived impossibilities loomed higher. By 1950, fear reached its climax. The exact event that determined the decision differs in many accounts, but what followed was unprecedented. Almost overnight, the entire community decided to leave. Families left their homes and belongings, and even their businesses. Without so much as an acknowledgement, Portlock's lifeblood, the cannery, was closed. Personal items were left behind, as if they were left with an expectation of return, which indeed never happened. It was a flight in terror rather than a voluntary decision. One man remained in the town somewhat longer, the postmaster. Determined to perform his duties, he stayed put long after almost everyone had left. He was eventually broken by the sounds of deliberate footsteps moving round and round his barricaded post office night after night. They did not sound like the light pad of any animal. They were heavy, bipedal, and deliberate. He described feeling the presence of something clearly intelligent, something that was testing his nerve. Within a matter of days, he too backpacked his belongings and departed, leaving Portlock completely deserted. When the speed with which people left took people aghast from neighboring towns. Those near Seldovia and Nanwalek told about how quickly people had vacated Portlock in a year's time. The once thrumming clam cannery now fell into a silence that echoed eerily with its ranks of abandoned cabins, giving the ghost town an almost staged quality, as if life had been frozen mid-scene. Even today, tourists walking through the ruins report similar unsettling sensations that people were around just hours ago, as if they had gone out to fetch their water and had never returned. Never was a monster written in the official records as the cause of Portlock's abandonment. Economic decline and dwindling fish runs were among the reasons mentioned, but they were all just telltale stories that the people who lived there spun. Nothing, not a job, not a paycheck, not even the promise of growth, was worth that kind of continuous dread. Every measure of safety had been tried, and every rule followed, and still people kept dying. The town didn't fall, it ran away. Yet the story didn't die, because the forest kept talking to those who dared listen. Prints, trees, and split testimony. Even after Portlock's residents vanished in 1950, the land did not grow silent. Hunters, travelers, and curious outsiders continued to pass through the abandoned village, and the stories they carried away only added fuel to the legend. In fact, some of the most unnerving encounters came after the town had already been deserted. In the 1970s, a small group of hunters sought shelter in Portlock during a storm. They built a fire inside one of the abandoned cabins, but their relief didn't last long. As darkness fell, something circled their camp. They heard low growls and guttural noises, sounds unlike any bear or wolf they knew. The most terrifying detail? The creature's steps crunched in the gravel with a rhythm that was unmistakably two-legged. For hours it prowled, sometimes moving close enough for the men to feel vibrations through the walls before retreating into the night. By morning, the hunters fled, shaken and certain they had encountered the Nantina itself. Around the same period, another hunting party tracking a moose near the Portlock area stumbled onto a sight that chilled them. They found oversized, human-like footprints, some measuring over 18 inches, long, pressed deep into the mud. Following the tracks, they discovered signs of a struggle. Grass torn up, claw marks on the earth, and then nothing. The moose tracks ended abruptly, as if the animal had been lifted away. But the massive footprints continued up into the mountains. To the hunters, there was no doubt. Something of extraordinary size and strength had carried the moose off, and it wasn't a predator they'd ever seen before. Then there are the trees. Among the strangest reports tied to Portlock are entire clusters of trees found upside down, root systems pointed skyward, and trunks jammed into the earth with a force no storm could explain. Witnesses insisted this wasn't random wind or landslide damage, but rather conscious, methodical, and almost ritualistic destruction. To the more skeptical, these accounts are perhaps exaggerations or misinterpretations of natural disaster. To believers, though, this is where the inverted trees shine, the unmistakable trademark of the Nantina, supposedly no mere animal, but instead a creature capable of manipulating an entire forest. Yet, human testimony remains divided. In 1990, an Anchorage paramedic made a statement regarding an unsettling encounter with an elderly Alutiiq man who once lived in Portlock. After suffering a heart attack in jail, the man was being treated at the time when casual conversation touched upon hunting. When the paramedic mentioned Portlock, the elder suddenly gripped his shirt with wide open eyes of terror and asked, "Did you see it? Did it bother you?" Even in guard restraint, he continued to repeat the question, his fear so palpable, almost as if the passing decades had in no way alleviated his traumatized memory. However, not all of the elders were in agreement in what context the Nantina might have been. To cite one example, Alutiiq elder Sally Ash downplayed the monster theory, insisting that economic opportunity nearby towns, with better schools, churches, and jobs, really explained why people left Portlock. Yet even she admitted that her people had lived under rules in which one spoke in silence around woods, followed curfews, and was always careful. To hear Melania Kell, her cousin, tell it, though, is completely another story. In interviews, she insisted the Nantina was real, that it had slain villagers and stalked the town until the people had no choice but to leave. Ironically, Ash once acted as a translator for Kell as part of an interview, yet later went on to refute her cousin's words. Their divergent accounts show the struggle to peel away fact from lore, memory from myth. For skeptics, all those divided testimonies and eerie phenomena, from footprints to overturned trees to mutilated bodies, boil down to natural causes: bears, storms, accidents, and the human mind's propensity to amplify fear in isolation. True believers, on the other hand, insist that the consistency of all this through generations, cultures, and decades suggests something far more tangible. Portlock, they contend, is haunted not by stories alone. It is haunted by a beast that marks its presence in ways we still cannot explain. If this deep dive gripped you, like, comment, and subscribe. Tell us which Portlock detail hit you hardest: the infrasound dread, the upside-down trees, or the postmaster's footsteps. And if you want more stories that blend history with horror, watch the next video on screen. We're pulling another thread that just might connect to Portlock's silent hunter.